Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the fantastic Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership body for academics and artists and animal advocates interested in all things to do with animals, animals issues and animal studies. ASA does a lot of good work, including holding a conference every 2 years. And this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from ASA's 2017 conference, which is being held at the University of Adelaide. So I'm very, very excited to be here. I have a very special guest. I'm speaking to Associate Professor Nik Taylor. Now, Nik is from the School of Social and Policy Studies at Flinders University, so she's an Adelaide lass. Nik is a prolific animal studies scholar, and anyone who has been a regular listener to this program and who follows ASA on Facebook or at their website will know Nik's work. Today we're going to discuss Nik's new book, which is called Ethnography for Humanism, which she has co-authored with Lindsay Hamilton and which is published by Palgrave Macmillan. Welcome to the podcast, Nik.
Hello, thanks for the invite.
Nik, can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. I think this book actually is kind of bringing together a lot of threads that run through my work. I'd done some previous work with Lindsay, who's the co-author of this book, and I'd also done a lot of work with other colleagues where we'd been doing research into how humans see other animals, how they treat other animals, and how we might be able to improve that. And one thing that constantly kept irritating me was the idea that we're doing this work on behalf of animals, but the animals are completely absent from the work. We rarely talk about them, we rarely see them, we don't include things like their biographies in our work. And so I've started to do a number of projects where I'm trying to make animals more visible in human animal studies work. And this book probably is the first of those, in as much as the first published. And the whole premise of the book is around how might we change social science methods to be more inclusive of the species that we're often doing this work on behalf of in the first place.
Yes, well, it's a brilliant idea and it's much needed work, so congratulations. Now, some of our listeners might not be familiar with the word ethnography. Can you tell us what that's about?
Sure. It's a contested term. People generally use it to mean any kind of qualitative research. I read it slightly more narrowly, and we do read it more narrowly in the book, in that it's more qualitative research that involves an element of observation, usually participant observation, can also be backed up by interviews, but it's research that it's a method that allows you to look in depth at the kind of populations, people, animals that you want to study by getting yourselves immersed in their life worlds, which I don't think you can do properly through an interview. You need to do something else on top of that.
Right. So for someone like myself who's an academic, and perhaps for many people listening, the word ethnography is used a fair bit, but you talk about multi-species ethnography. So what does that mean to you?
And again, I'm taking a broader reading on this. Then there are a lot of people working in multi-species ethnography at the minute, and it's become a term, and the way that it's used there is quite narrow. But more broadly for me, it's really research that allows us to acknowledge and include other animals in our fieldwork, in our methods. So multi-species ethnography can be anything from interviewing companion animal owners, but having their animals with them present at the time, or it can be something completely different, like say a sound walk or a smell walk around a city where you notice other animals, or in fact I walked by your dogs on a smell walk that will take you through the city. So there's various manifestations of multi-species ethnography, but the key is that it brings other animals into our spaces through our research methods.
Wonderful. So you describe your research as the study of human-animal interactions in institutions and organisations. What do you mean by institutions and organisations, and why is that important to what you're doing?
It's because I'm a sociologist that we talk about institutions and organisations, and to me, the way that we treat animals is largely an outcome of how they're positioned in organisations and institutions, and I mean positioned materially as well as symbolically. So this also includes looking at like the kind of discursive constructions of institutions or of animals in institutions. And I think that it's important because I think that the vast majority of our interactions with non-wild animals certainly it's mediated through institutions. And so if we want to change their lives for the better, we want to give them more rights and more acknowledgement and more respect, then we need to tackle the institutions that position them as inferior in the first place.
So you note that it's not uncommon for researchers to dismiss other species that they observe as part of their field work with perhaps a throwaway comment, perhaps a footnote, etc. And I'm wondering if you include in this people who are animal studies scholars, and if you have any thoughts about why this is occurring.
I certainly include animal studies scholars, including myself, actually, because I have been just as guilty of doing research that privileges the human understanding of the world and the way that we socially construct other animals without actually trying to bring animals in. So I think that in some ways I think we're guilty of it, but it's understandable because, again, if we want to make change, positive change for animals, then we have to acknowledge that their poor treatment is at the hands of humans. So we need to understand what humans think about them and why they treat them the way that they do. So I do think that there is room in animal studies for research that's not species inclusive. That said, I think if we continue to silence animals through our research methods, then we are often inadvertently plugging into the idea that animals are somehow inferior and don't matter as much, and so we're part of the problem rather than the solution. But I think it happens because I think our intellectual history of scientific positivism essentially says that animals don't matter. So why would we even think about including them in our methods?
So you invite us to unlearn tendencies towards human superiority. How can we start unlearning that tendency?
Well, I'm not sure I have all the answers here. I think I'll limit it to how we might unlearn them in terms of research. And I think that there are lots of things that we can do. We can do research that is deliberately for other animals. It's about changing their lives or changing the structures and institutions that allow us to abuse them in the way that humans do. And we can include them in our research. So one of the things I've just written a chapter which I called the rat chapter. And I wrote the biographies of the rescued rats that have recently come into my house. And I think we could do this more as animal studies scholars. We could bring the animals in, we could talk about them, their histories, their biographies. We could individualise them so that we see them as we see them at an individual level as opposed to an aggregate level, which I think allows us to abuse them as well. So I think we can unlearn human superiority in terms of our methods. How we do that culturally, I think, is the basis of the entirety of the field of animal studies. So that's a bigger question.
Yeah. So, Nik, what kind of methods would you like to see us using when we're conducting research that includes non-human animals?
I mean, it depends what you want to find out. Personally, I love visual methods. And I will be the first to admit that even with visual methods, it's human interpretation of images. So it doesn't get away from all of the problems that we're identifying in the book. But I do think that images capture people's attention. They get people having conversations about issues that they might not have talked about or thought about previously, and they allow us to actually include the animals that we're dealing with in the various projects. So I think there's a lot of traction for visual imagery in human animal studies. There are other more innovative ideas, but again, it's going to come down to what you actually want to find out from your research.
So, Nik, you describe yourself as an activist scholar. Can you tell us what you mean by that term and phrase?
It means a lot, actually. I mean, on one level, I think it means that I I acknowledge a political position, an ideological position in my research. I think all research is ideological and political anyway, but I acknowledge that I have a particular stance in my own, which is leaning towards animal liberation, and that I'm upfront about that, the politicised nature of the research that I do, that I never claim my research is neutrally just about finding more knowledge. It's about finding more knowledge to make animal lives better. And that's probably in a nutshell where I come from. I came into academia through an animal shelter background, and so I was already deeply politicised around issues of animals, and I've never been able to move away from that. And the research that I do is informed by feminism, and of course many radical feminists also take this position. So I think it really is just about I advocate on behalf of animals. I use my voice as much as I can in as many public places as I can to talk about the abuse of animals and how we might think to change that.
Would you like to see more academics identifying as activist scholars?
All of them. Yeah. I'd like to see all of them. Knowledge isn't neutral. Nobody produces neutral knowledge. We've all got an agenda somewhere in terms of what we're trying to find out. And I think we're in a ridiculously privileged position as academics, and for us not to use that in order for the social good, for the public good, including other species, I think is a travesty. So I think all academics should be activist scholars.
Wonderful. Well, Nik, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I certainly am.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, I'm sorry to do this to you straight away, but I'm going to come up with 2. The first one I ever read was Singer's Animal Liberation, which I know is cliche, and I can remember my supervisor giving it to me. And I'm not particularly a fan of the arguments in that book. But what I did love was that it opened my eyes to the idea that animals could be included in scholarship, and that was worth its weight in gold. And the next book that I jumped to that was far more formative for me was Harriet Ripbo's Animal Estate, which I think is a beautiful book and would encourage anybody to read.
I love that book. I think it's just beautiful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I can't. I don't necessarily want to, but I certainly can. I wrote a piece in the middle of my PhD for Animal Issues, which I think is now a defunct journal, although maybe they've got their back issues online, where I took issue with Gary Francione's argument around new welfarism and animal rights activists, because the data that I'd collected for my PhD from animal rights activists disproved his idea that activists were somehow sitting in the middle of rights and welfare, which he derogatorily called new welfarism, but it wasn't a particularly good paper. I stand by the argument, but it wasn't particularly well written.
We've got to walk before we can run.
That's right.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That's a tough one, actually, because my intellectual heritage is more through feminism. And I'm going to go with 2 people who are actually my colleagues. So Tanya Signal and Heather Fraser. They've both been really formative in very different ways in terms of my own trajectory in animal studies. Tanya challenges me because she has a very different ideological position than I do, which leads to some very interesting arguments. And Heather is a critical social worker who works around oppression, who has pulled me more over into that kind of literature, which is tremendously important.
Oh, fantastic. And Tanya's going to be on an upcoming episode of Knowing Animals, so stay tuned.
Yep.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Use your voice. Like I said, we're in this privileged position. We are seen as experts, as truth sayers. Do your research, get the information, get informed opinions out to the public about why we need to change the way that we treat animals. Institutionally, systemically, we abuse them, and so use your voice to change that.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Respect. I think we need to respect other animals. We need to respect them as individuals, respect their bodily integrity, whether this is a dog in your home who you deny agency to, or whether it's the pig that's destined to be on some people's plates. We need to respect that their life means as much to them as our lives does to us, and then change our entire cultural setup around how we treat them based on that respect.
Well, Nik, what are you working on next?
I'm working on my next book, which is on the back of a project that I'm doing with women who have survived domestic violence and how their animals are helping them, for want of a better term, heal in the post-violence phase. And there's two aspects to this project. One is visual, so we've taken, the photographs have been taken of the women by volunteers, of the women with their animals, and we're analysing these images, and we've done interviews with the women, and that's the entirety of the project, and that is that will be in a book that will be due out sometime next year if I meet my deadline.
So where can people find out more about your work?
Probably the best place is the Animals in Society working group at Flinders. We have our own website and we have an open Facebook page that anyone interested in our research can join.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Nik, thank you so much for joining us at Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Also, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. iTunes love it when you leave a review. Thank you very much. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.